It's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Z, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel, broadcasting live from Studio Z.
Makes me act the way I do.
Welcome to Eat, Pray, Run, where slow food in the apocalypse doesn't mean you're ending up on the menu. I hope you brought your appetites. I'm Dr. Erica O'Neill, and today we've got a Neanderthal cook-along for you. We'll be discussing what our ancient cousins ate with archaeologist Rebecca Wragg Sykes, and food writer and stylist Anna Burges-Lumsden will walk us through how to make a multi-course meal. This episode is sponsored by the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at North Carolina State University. And I just want to give you a sneak peek into the kitchen here to say hello to Anna. Anna will bring you back on shortly to introduce our first dish. But right now, I would like to introduce you all to the host of Eat, Pray, Run, Dr. Rob Dunn. Rob, you are affiliated with North Carolina University. I'll put your entire title up. Very impressive. You recently published a book, and it relates a lot to the topic we're going to talk about today about the evolution of flavor. Can you tell us a bit about that and kind of what's up for us next on the show?
I'm trying to decide what awkward thing it says about me that I'm not tall enough to stand above my title. So the new book is about flavor and the evolution of flavor, and we talk a lot about how our ancestors used flavor to make decisions in their world. And so I'm super excited about the show today because we're going to get to talk to Rebecca and Anna about Neanderthals and food, but then also to explore the kind of menu that we might creatively imagine features the sorts of flavors that Neanderthals might have enjoyed. And so a little bit of neuroscience, a little bit of ecology, a little bit of evolution, and then some cured meat and drinks to go with it. So it should be very fun.
Wonderful. A little bit of fermented things out there, keeping things good a bit longer in the pantry. Let's introduce our first host so she can talk a bit about that, and I'll bring her on. Welcome, Dr. Rebecca Wragg Sykes. Rebecca is an archaeologist, author, and honorary fellow at the University of Liverpool. And Rebecca also recently published a book called Kindred, Neanderthal Life, Love, Death, and Art. There is the beautiful cover.
That way.
Welcome to the show, Rebecca. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me. This is really fun. I've been plotting this with Anna for a few years, so we can't wait.
But I think one of the places we wanted to start off here is to give some geographic context to the dishes we'll be talking about today. And I think one of the things I always forget, and Rebecca, your book reminds me, is that the Neanderthals really had an enormous geographic range. And so what we get to draw on and thinking about what a Neanderthal menu, what we can imagine it being like today as we sort of feature elements of it, is not just Northern Europe. So what's the range we're thinking about here?
Yeah, I mean, if people are viewing this thinking that we're just going to be eating reindeer and sort of stuff from the tundra, that's not the reality of the Neanderthal world. They definitely did live during cold periods when most of Eurasia was kind of a bit like Siberia today, so very harsh winters, but summer's not too bad. And they also lived during climatic periods we call interglacials, which is basically exactly like right now, where most of Eurasia was forest, open landscapes as well, but grassy, really, quite nice, and filled with different kinds of game, smaller game, and a lot of plant food as well. So that's one of the things to have in mind about the sort of things that we've chosen to have on today.
So as we get started here, I mean, one of the things that we talked about is the extent to which Neanderthals needed to store food, and especially in the colder parts of their geographic ranges, to store food in the winter. And so we have some meats. Anna and Rebecca, can we talk about what we have?
Let me bring on Anna first. I'll introduce her, and she can show this off while Rebecca can talk about what's on the plate, and then we'll shoot over to Anna. So Anna here is Anna Burges-Lumsden. She's a food writer and food stylist, and she has been collaborating with Rebecca to help bring this Neanderthal cook-along to life and kind of reinterpret those dishes through a modern lens of what it is that we have available in our own kitchens. So welcome, Anna.
Thank you very much. Very lovely to be here.
What is the first thing that you have created for us today?
Well, I've got some cocktails here, which I thought would be quite fun to get the thing rolling. So we've got Rosamund Martini, which is rose hip syrup. I couldn't get any rose hips at this time of year, so I had to buy some, unfortunately, for that, but would normally make some of that. And then some rose petal gin, which I have actually made. Just put some dried rose petals, got some nice rose petals here, and put that in some gin, which was quite fun. So we put that in there. And then we've got a little bit of lemon, and then shaking it up in a martini glass and, in a cocktail shaker. And here we go. Pretty potent, but yummy.
Looks great. So bright and vibrant.
And then I've got another one here, which is the Linford gimlet. Now this I made some nettle cordial, which was quite a fun experience. Just trying to find nettles. I live in London, so that was interesting, finding ones that were good for a cordial. And then the minute you put them in with citric acid and lemon and sugar, they turn pink, which is kind of crazy. So you get a pink cordial from the nettle cordial. And then with that, I put sloe gin, and I've topped it up with soda water and a bit of lime. So that should be pretty yummy and very refreshing.
So are nettles and sloe gin things that would have been around back then? Maybe we can go to Rebecca here and we can get an answer on that.
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember that the span of time Neanderthals were around sounds dreadfully long, you know, that they emerged around 350,000 years ago. But in terms of climates and environments, as long as it's an interglacial like it is now, so it's warm period, pretty much you're talking about the same kinds of plants that were around today. So when it was a warmer time, and even during some of the cooler periods, we certainly know that nettles were around because we can find the pollen for this. So as archaeologists, we use pollen, but also we have what we call macro remains, which are basically the big bits of plants, seeds, nuts, even leaves sometimes. And so across all the different sorts of sites, certainly sloe berries would have been around, lots of other kinds of berries as well.
So we've got a couple of questions from the audience here about Neanderthals and alcohol. So is there any evidence at all that they were doing things purposely, or is this kind of natural fermenting of things that they might have stumbled upon in the wild, or are these just some fun that we're interpreting with the palette of flavors that Neanderthals had?
Well, we are having fun today with the cocktails, and there is no archaeological evidence, but I think Rob may have some things to say about sort of naturally occurring alcohols and who might be eating those.
Yes, so certainly recent research by Katie Amato and other folks has suggested that fermentation of fruits is probably much earlier than people think. And it's not very hard and leaves very difficult to do, and leaves basically no residue in the archaeological record. And so it's entirely possible they could have been fermenting berries or fruits, and it's not clear what we would see of that. And so certainly there's no evidence that they did, but there's also no evidence of the absence. And so we don't know. And so I think for today, we can imagine it was possible and enjoy.
It may have happened accidentally. Perhaps there was a fruit harvest one year and it got left a bit too long, and who knows, they had an interesting winter season.
So I see some dried meats there. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that, Anna, and then maybe you could contextualize it for us both, Rob and Rebecca.
Yeah, so here we've got lardo, rosemary infused actually. Then we've got air-dried venison. We've got smoked duck here, and then we've also got some wild boar salami as well. So here we go, lots of yummy things.
Where have you sourced these things? In your own backyard, or did you order out special?
No, I did order them in specially actually from Truly Farm Charcuterie. They've got all sorts of amazing things. So yeah, it's definitely worth checking out what they have.
So I think those meats pose a really interesting question that I'm fascinated with, which is that, we make meats like this. We cure meats in part to store them, and also because they taste better. They have more complex flavors than the raw meats do. But what do we know, Rebecca, about food storage in Neanderthals? So let's say you kill a mammoth, you kill a bunch of deer, you've got all this meat, and you eat what you can eat at that time. What do you do with the rest? And what do you imagine the answer is going to no doubt partially be we don't know, but what could they have done?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We don't know entirely for sure. And storage is really interesting because, as you say, if you catch something very large and it has a lot of different resources on it, especially fat, really important for hunter-gatherers. You don't just want lean meat. If you put a lot of effort, expended a lot of calories to actually bring something down, you don't really want to just leave it all there for the hyenas to sort of, enjoy themselves. It makes sense, if you can, to take that away and store it. And then that also has implications for your whole system of living through the landscape. You may stay in particular places, things like this. But for Neanderthals, overall, there is no direct evidence that they were using food storage. They don't have pots to store things in. We also have very little evidence that they were digging pits very much. Pits in later prehistory, say like the Bronze Age, Iron Age, those are often used as means to store food. We don't really see that for Neanderthals, but there are some possibilities. And the reason we think that they may have been sort of interested in doing this is because although we have archaeological sites which are hunting sites, and you have a carcass, what we can see is that they leave behind the least valuable parts of the carcass, like the spine and things like this. They take quite often haunches of meat, jointed stuff, also the fat and things. So we can see that they're very selective in how they butcher. And then when we compare what goes on at different places in the landscape, you can see that they partition up where they're doing things. So they have a kill site, primary sort of butchery goes on. Sometimes they have a secondary processing site where they process it a bit more, and then food ends up at living sites where it's consumed. So with this level of sort of separation through the landscape and through time of these animal products, and we see the same thing with what they do with stone as well, it's not a big jump to think that perhaps the soft products, the fats and the meat that we can't see archaeologically, maybe then went on further, stored in some form. And as I was saying before, fats are clearly one of the things they target, as well as marrow. And you can actually use marrow and fat itself as a means to help preserve meat. But also there's other things like air drying, like this food that Anna has there. That's why we chose this, because, making jerky, slicing your meat up fine, hanging it up in the wind, we just would not see the evidence of that, but it's possible that it was going on.
And so they were using fire at some sites, so they could have been smoking it if they were hanging it, right? Yeah. Smoking
is possible. Yeah, I mean, we have some evidence of a few hearths, for example, where they're burning very, very rotten wood, and they would have been well aware it was more rotten than normal, and that's the kind of wood that produces loads of smoke. So that might have been to do with food preservation as well.
Can you talk just a quick minute about preserving with fat? Because a lot of the audience is probably familiar with kind of smoke and drying like jerky, but how would you preserve food with fat?
Well, I mean, Rob can talk about that if he wants.
Well, yeah, fat's actually like outside of my realm of expertise. But what do we have there? So what's the
Oh, the lardo stuff you've got.
The lardo, yeah.
Yeah, this is infused with rosemary, but it's, yeah. Can you see? Up close.
Which one are we looking at?
That one is the lardo.
Okay.
So talk about the lardo a little bit.
If you use fat, you basically think of like pemmican. Okay, so pemmican is a traditional indigenous American kind of food for some communities there, and that's basically meat that you mash up with the fat. There's many different ways of doing it, but having the fat around the meat helps it be preserved. Basically, it's another means of stopping sort of oxygen getting to it, and you can end up going into the realms of fermenting things as well, which is Rob's absolute specialism. But yeah, that is one means. But to talk about fermenting and meat, and this brings in the cocktail actually that Anna mentioned, the Linford gimlet. The reason I chose that is because Linford is a site in Britain where we have a lot of mammoth. It's like a sort of a river channel, and there's about at least 11 mammoth were there and were very likely butchered by Neanderthals, got all their tools there. But it's a wet site, and water is another means by which you can actually preserve meat if you submerge it. Depending on how long you do that, you might end up actually fermenting it. But that could be an explanation as to why Neanderthals are returning to this place, if it was sort of, you know, a mini sort of lakey river channel, and the mammoth are in there. And that's one way to actually stop the meat spoiling, because a mammoth is so huge, you can't actually take apart a whole mammoth carcass and move it around.
Yeah, and as we've talked about, there are much later examples of ancient modern humans and Clovis humans in North America who look to have fermented big mammals in ponds by butchering them and then sort of fastening them to the bottom of the pond. And so this is conceivable. And foxes do versions of this by burying things, not in water, but underground. Hyenas do it. So the idea that Neanderthals would have figured out how to store some of their food seems not so far-fetched. Wolverines do it. I mean, hyenas even will drag prey items into the ocean and then bring them back salted. And so if other species are doing it, it's not a jump to imagine that Neanderthals would have watched other species. They would have seen what the fox did. And so it seems possible, at least. But maybe we should move on to the next menu item, because I think we have a really exciting next dish. Is the casserole what we have next up?
Yes, it is. We've got this lovely thing going in that. Here we go. Nice pig supper.
Amazing.
But it's not all gory. We do have other normal, nice, yummy things as well. And that's just purely there to add flavour and to really give a sort of thickness to the sauce. Because as I understand it, Neanderthals needed 5,000 calories a day to survive, because they had pretty active lifestyle. So they needed to have the extra fat. So that's why we've got those in there. So I've also got rabbit legs here, which are going to go in, and some marrow. I've chopped up some pig's trotters, because obviously it's not very practical to cook it as a whole thing. So there's some chopped up ones, and here's some bone marrow. And that's just, I'm going to roast those off for about half an hour and then add them to the casserole. And they will just release loads and loads of flavour and really enrich the sauce. We won't actually eat them. It's just purely to enrich the sauce, that's all. There's also going to be some bacon and some apples and some cider and a bit of wild garlic as well. So lots of lovely things to make it really delicious. We've also got some pearl barley as well to give it a bit of thickness, because they didn't have potatoes in those days. So we need something to give it a bit of body. So yes, we've added a bit of pearl barley to that as well.
And some carrots.
Yes, that's roasted heritage carrots. I'll just show you. I've got them. I need to peel these. I've got nice different coloured ones here. So purple and yellow and orange. So I'm going to peel those, cook them in a bit of goose fat. And you can add some wild thyme or maybe some of this beautiful rosemary, because it's so pretty. And a little bit of orange at the end, just to kind of give it a bit of flavour. And yeah, we'll roast those and serve that along with it to give it a bit of colour.
Excellent. This is a great time to say that all of these menu items are going to be updated on the YouTube page. So afterwards, we'll take every single one of these recipes and put it in the description. So if you want to recreate this at home, you're more than welcome to follow along. Take what you learned here and approach it.
And for this recipe, I really love this one, that each of these items is actually featured in the archaeological record in one way or another, right? There's Ram Barkai, our paleoanthropologist, has argued that Neanderthals might have really enjoyed the feet of elephants and mammoths. There's evidence for root eating, I think, Rebecca, is this right?
Yeah, I mean, when Anna and I put this together, this is like one of the ones that's sort of most rooted in the archaeology and also the possibilities within those Eurasian environments. So start off with, rabbits, absolutely. Neanderthals were not only hunting big game. Yes, they were after mammoths, rhinoceros, big horses, but also they were eating smaller species, duck. That's why we had duck at the beginning in the jerky bit. And also boar as well. That's like sort of medium-sized game in woodland environments. So we're combining those two things. And the marrow is really important, as Anna was saying. Depending on where they lived, the amount of calories is going to vary, but they certainly would have had extremely energy-intensive lifestyles, and they would have really needed to feed up. And we definitely know from the archaeological record that smashing up bones from marrow was a fundamental part of Neanderthal life. There's very few sites, certainly living sites, where you have the kill site, primary butchery, maybe secondary butchery site, and then the living sites. It's at those third kind of sites where stuff is being brought in from the landscape. You just see masses, hundreds of thousands of splinters of bone, and that is because they are after the marrow. What they're doing with the marrow is not entirely sort of certain, but what we can see is there is some burning going on at sites. They definitely can control fire, and we have abundant hearths as well. There's no question that hearths were central to their lives. We have some cases where you can look at the micro layers in the sediment around the hearths, and we can see sort of fat deposits in there, as if something is sort of dripping in. So that could be off a joint roasting, or it may be some of this marrow processing. The other option is that they're actually making stews, which is why we've got a stew here. Cooking out bones and marrow in a stew is very efficient because you get all the stuff and it stays in the sauce, and it's all the goodness is there. And to bring in sort of the plants, the pearl barley, there is actually evidence from the calculus in Neanderthal teeth. That's like the stuff that you go to the hygienist to get removed. We get tiny, tiny little pieces of sort of evidence stuck in the calculus of Neanderthal's teeth, and this includes starches. And those starches come from plants, and they are identifiable, just like pollen is. And some of those are starches from wild grains. And from a site called Shanidar in Iraq, you can tell that those starches have been heated, and it's not dry heat. It appears that it was basically boiled. So that's some evidence that sort of some kind of stew-like cooking was going on in some places. With the carrots, I chose carrots because we wanted to have a side dish, and carrots are a wild root in Eurasia. They don't look like the ones that Anna's peeling now. These are domesticated varieties, very much larger, but the carrot family is available, and they are an easily foraged food source. We don't have direct evidence for that, but we do know from another site in Northern Europe that, again, this is from the tooth calculus stuff, that some Neanderthals were eating water lily roots. So, we're not cooking with water lily roots today because we didn't want to go sort of too left field. And so we thought maybe, carrot is a good compromise here.
Fantastic. I've highlighted Anna here so that we can watch what's happening in her kitchen while you guys narrate over it, because I think she is the most visually interesting box in all of our little yearbook photos at the moment. Rob, what do you think about this stew?
I'm distracted by the carrots. I think it's wonderful. I mean, the other thing that I find fascinating, this question of how important flavor was to Neanderthals, and as Rebecca and I have talked about before, that we tend to imagine other species in general, and Neanderthals in particular, as just going about their lives trying to survive. But they had all the same sort of sensory apparatus that we do. And so I think it's much more reasonable to imagine that they preferred some foods over others, and some things were more flavorful and delicious, and that they chose those things. And so one of the things we actually argue in our book is that building on work by Ron Barkai, is that maybe the feet of some of the animals they ate, in particular elephants and and mammoths were particularly delicious. And so I like to see the foot featured here. And for elephants, part of what it's thought was delicious is the actual foot pad, that once cooked, it becomes really soft. And sort of historical evidence for elephant eating suggests that people really enjoyed the feet. And so I think the foot here is a nod to that possibility.
Yeah,
Rebecca,
and
is that far-fetched, or is it something there?
No, I don't. I think so. I mean, we know that they, as I said, we know they are eating mammoths. There's isotopic evidence, which is basically biochemical evidence from bones. We can assess the kind of animals that were being eaten in particular sites based on analysing the Neanderthals themselves. And so we know they definitely were eating mammoth. And during interglacial environments, as I was saying, these warmer kind of times when it was a bit like now, you would have had elephant species in Eurasia. Actually some of them bigger than African elephants. So they're called straight tusk elephants. They're huge. And it does appear that they also were being eaten. So yeah, there's no reason why there couldn't have been sort of favourite parts of species. And as I was saying before, we can tell from the bones left behind at kill sites that they really were very aware of the anatomy of the animals that they were killing. They were extremely selective. They knew exactly which parts had the richest marrow. Those were the ones that they took with them. And so the fact that they might be selecting on flavour as well, we've got to remember offal is really important. Tongues, eyeballs, guts, brains, we can actually see the cut marks on the insides of animal skulls where they're getting all this good stuff out, all the juicy bits. And if you don't grow up with an offal eating cuisine, that might sound a bit much, but it's a traditional food across much of the world, and it was everywhere until recently. And that's because it's very nutritious. There's really good stuff in there. You don't want to waste it. But coming back to what Rob was saying about taste as well, that's also why we sort of went with the wild garlic, because anybody that has experienced wild garlic in forests, you can't miss it. It's the smell fills the air as you walk along, and that's a plant that would be noticeable and interesting. And I think Neanderthals were, given what we see and how they experimented with other materials in their lives, of course they're going to experiment with plants and assess the different kinds of resources around. And the same with crab apples. Crab apples, the wild version of the apples we eat, when you try those, they're very tart, but there is a sweetness at the beginning of it, so they just need a bit of processing.
So I've got a great question here from the audience, and that's about the possibility that were Neanderthals more plant matter or meat kind of driven in how they're approaching the intake for their food? I know 5,000 calories is a lot of calories to have to gather per person per day. So what sort of approach did they take?
We have to look at the context that they're in. When I'm talking about glacial periods, when it's cold, when there's mammoth and reindeer and stuff, it's going to be largely meat focused. And that's what we see in the isotopes backing that up. However, there are more modern methods of isotopic analysis that allow you to sort of pull out the amount of protein or some estimate of the amount of protein that's coming from plants. And it's a little bit higher than we thought. It might even be up to 20%, even in cooler environments, which is surprising. And then another way we can assess sort of the meat versus plant is by looking at the wear that accumulates on teeth. So anything you eat leaves microscopic scratches on the enamel on your teeth. Mm-hmm. And we can tell by looking at samples of Neanderthals from all different sorts of periods when the climate was changing. During the warmer periods when we would expect there to be more plants, their teeth do show more plant matter, and there are some contexts when they actually don't look that different than some cultures from sort of agricultural context or sort of pastoral hunter-gatherers. So there must have been a fair amount. But with the toothware, you have to sort of remember as well that they also use their teeth to process materials. So you have to pick those two things out, and that can be done, but it's tricky.
So we have a bunch of great questions here. Another one is about cooking vessels, and maybe I'll broaden that out a little bit. So we look at Anna's beautiful kitchen here, and there are all kinds of cooking vessels, and the world of things with which to cook here is diverse and particular. What tools, what vessels, what did the Neanderthals have to work with when they came home with their meat and their roots and other bits and pieces? How did they cook?
We know, I mean, I said before, fire, certainly that's part of it. We know that they have a range of different kinds of stone tool products. So they have many different ways of taking a stone block and reducing it down and making different sorts of products to suit different needs. So they have very sharp flakes and blades, and that's perfect for slicing. But they also had flakes that they would blunt along the edge to turn them into scrapers, basically. And so that is going to be useful for a different kind of processing. What we don't have is any kind of like stone pestle and mortars, that kind of thing. Although there are some quite rare, but they do exist, sort of blocks where it looks like some abrasion has been going on. So that they may have been grinding foods as well as other materials now and then, but it's not sort of at the level you would see in like an agricultural society, like a Neolithic people, first farmers. But there's a site from northern Spain called Abric Romani, which has amazing preservation of wood. And there is an object from there. It's actually a cast of an object that's preserved. And it looks basically exactly like a cleaver, like with a long handle. And then it sort of opens up and it just looks like, but that would have been made of wood. So that's kind of challenging our assumptions about what you can do with wood. And yeah, there's no reason why you couldn't use it to chop things up if it has a sharp edge. Same with bamboo, actually, as well. That's always a discussion of what goes on in sort of Eastern Eurasia and those kind of resources. But in terms of tools overall, probably it's largely stone stuff, but they also did have digging sticks. And so the idea that you might be using a digging stick not only to extract roots, for example, but to then like pulverize them, that's possible. I mean, for example, with the water lily root, how is that being eaten? Are they just crunching on it raw? Are they stewing that, or is it sort of being pulverized up? It's very difficult to be sure. But if you go with the conservative view, then probably it's largely their stone tools that they're using.
I think the stick tools is so fascinating, and the idea that there was like a wooden cleaver is such a beautiful thing, right? The craft that it takes to make something like that and to figure out exactly how you use it. But it also reminds me of all the chimpanzee researchers that we ended up talking to for the book. And for chimps, across chimp populations, there are tens of kinds of stick tools used for different things. And so, I mean, I think we imagine our common ancestors with chimps also using those kinds of tools, but basically none of them survive in the fossil and subfossil and archaeological record, except in really rare cases. And so the idea that there are these missing stick and wood components to their portfolio is something I hadn't thought so much about. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the whole question of the like what we sometimes call the ghost realm of organic objects. When you look at recent hunting and gathering peoples, the vast majority of the stuff that they make and live with every day is not stone. It's almost all like plant material or leather, or, you know, stuff from animals, but it's stuff that will not easily preserve in the archaeological record unless you have unusual circumstances. Most often, if a site is waterlogged, then those kind of things will preserve better. And that's why, for example, some of the wooden digging sticks and also some hunting spears we have from a horse hunting site 330,000 years old. That's from a lake shore and actually in the lake. So that's why those wooden objects survived. So I think we should definitely assume that a large proportion of the things that they were making are not going to be sort of knowable to us. And also similarly, you know, for arguments about, you know, how do they carry stuff? we have this idea of them going out hunting and gathering, and that's a lot of things to carry around the landscape. And we don't know what kind of bags they used. Sure, you can use an animal stomach, for example, to transport water. That's quite handy. But presumably, from the evidence we have, that they were working animal skins, and that's not controversial. Then maybe they used skins and rolled stuff up in it, carried it. But also plant fibers is a possibility. And there is really exciting new research that from a French site that uncovered a tiny, tiny little piece of what looks like a sort of twisted thread made from bark from a conifer, or maybe a root from a conifer species. It's very, very small, very fine. So it's not like a rope. It's more like sort of, thread. But that could be a window into many other sort of uses of plants, fibers for carrying things, and possibly for processing, baskets, things like this. And when we look later on, not that long after Neanderthals, so about 28,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens, there are some sites from Eastern Europe where we can see there's already really quite complicated cordage and sort of twisted weaving stuff, basically. That has to have a more ancient origin, and perhaps Neanderthals had some level of that too.
Yeah, we have someone that I think you answered their question. They were reading your mind while they were typing it in the comments section. But let's check in with Anna quick and see what she's up to over here. I'll put you on solo layout. We're all behind the scenes here, really curious to see what you've got and what the next step is.
Okay, so I've got some bacon and some shallots browning off here. So that's kind of ready to go now with the next stage. I'll just pop that on the side. And I'm just putting salt and pepper on these rabbit legs, and I'm going to pop them in a bag with some flour, because that's the easiest way of getting the flour evenly around them. So I'll just pop it in. Might actually do one at a time because it'll be easier. And this just slightly protects the meat, and it makes a nice sort of crispy layer, just because there's no fat really on the outside of this, or skin. So it's quite a good way of protecting it and making it much nicer.
Yeah, we've had all the delicious fat from the marrow bones that you're using to create that sauce.
Yes. So that's there in the oven. I'll show you those. I'll pop those in earlier. Let me get them out.
You've already done the work of pre-cracking them. You didn't have to use any stone tools for them. They're nicely bisected for us.
I know, I think I might have broken all my tools if I tried that. Yeah, so here they are. They've just been roasting a little while. They need a bit longer. You want a nice sort of golden colour on them before you can add them to the casserole. And you see they're already starting to release quite a lot of fat, so that's good. That we want that. But I'll pop them back in. They need a bit longer.
Wonderful. You've also got some apples there, it looks like. Are those going in with the rabbit?
Yes. So I've just peeled and chopped some apple. So that I'm going to fry that off with the bacon and onions as well, because that adds a nice sort of fruitiness to it. And we're going to add some cider as well. So that's going to be next.
Much sweeter than crab apples.
Yeah. But I need to just fry off the rabbit as well. And then it'll all go into a big pot and cook for a little while with some bay leaves and a few strips of lemon, because that really kind of cuts through it, stops it being, because it's a bit sweet. Rabbit naturally is a little bit sweet. And obviously you've got the apple and the cider, so the lemon sort of cuts through that and really helps boost the flavour. So that's a wrap.
All right. I'm looking forward to what you create by the time we check in next.
Yeah, we are cheating a little bit with the flour. Obviously, Neanderthals don't have flour, although they're, again, not that long after them in the Upper Paleolithic period, so the people that came just after them, there is evidence of grinding of plants to produce flour. So that may also be earlier than, some of the viewers are expecting. That goes back a long way.
Rebecca, Sam has a question here about whether or not it's possible that the grains were cooked within the meat, like stuffing. And maybe more generally, what do we know about ingredients being mixed?
We don't have any evidence for that. So like, you know, and I was saying before, in like the micro layers of sediment around hearth, you get sort of fats, you get lots of tiny splinters of bone and things like this, but we don't have anything preserved of the equivalent that you find in later prehistoric sites, where you can sample the inside of pots, for example. You know, you can chemically sample those and you can come up with like recipes, or in the body of the Iceman, Ötzi, who is a copper / Bronze Age person who only lived a few thousand years ago. And so we could look at the contents of his stomach and see what he actually ate, you know, his last meal. We can't do that with Neanderthals. It would be amazing to find a frozen Neanderthal body, then we would, you know, be able to see what they actually ate. But in terms of what we find archaeologically, there's no sort of handy preserved recipe showing how foods may have been combined. So we don't know that. I mean, it would make sense just from an economic point of view to combine the cooking of different items. I mean, you have to think Neanderthals are hunter-gatherers. They are mobile. They move around a lot. We don't think they really spent more than a few weeks at most at any site at any one time. And we can actually see sort of an angle on this in terms of the kind of wood that is in their hearths. Generally, it's dead wood, so just stuff that they collect off the trees. You know, they're not knocking down whole trees and storing firewood. This is a very sort of, you come in, you use the stuff that's there, you go on again. So in that sense, we should expect that they are going to be quite economical about the kind of firewood and the resources they use. So maybe they will combine things. And I said before, you know, you can actually cook using an animal's stomach. If you put water in that, as long as the flames don't go above the level of the water, as I understand, this is like a Boy Scout thing that people know, you know, it won't burn. So they did have the potential for containers, although, you know, we think of them as not having containers because they don't have pottery. You could cook in an animal skull. There's various ways around it. So it's possible, but we don't have direct evidence for anything as complicated as what Anna is putting together. This is very much a modern sort of fusion take on it.
So no old school haggis.
No
evidence in the record for that.
But on the other hand, we do see that they understood the concept of mixing things and recipes of other things. So we can see, for example, that they used pigment mixes in some places, and also for their composite technology, which is where you have like a stone bit and a wooden handle and you use a glue to stick them together. There is a site from Italy where the glue is a mix, where they've mixed a pine resin with beeswax. So they understand how to mix different things to get a new result, a new material property. But I mean, beeswax, that was so unexpected. That's only a few years ago that came out, and that raises the possibility of, you know, honey, which we'll see is appearing later.
I guess the other window what we will have in the coming years on this is fecal samples, right? That's getting more and more possible to, well, I know from my hallway here, I know Sistiaga and others are working on fecal samples. And so we would at least know if things were eaten in the same time period together as fecal samples become better analyzed. We won't know, were they mixed? We know they got mixed eventually.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose maybe this is not the right thing to talk about while people are cooking, but maybe you could have like partially undigested stuff that shows you that there's like a lump of stuff that's mixed. Let's not go there.
Anna did not approve of that one. So let's go to this next question. So Zainab has a great question. How were they communicating? Did they have a specific language? What were their interactions like? And maybe how is our thinking about that changed? Because I would say a few decades ago, the idea that they were speaking was, everyone thought they weren't. And my sense is that's shifting, has shifted.
Yeah, I mean, it's an enormous topic, and I could go on about it for 10 minutes. I won't, because we don't have the time and we want to talk about the last recipe. But certainly where we are now in terms of archaeologists and sort of broad opinion, there is very little question that speech, so vocal communication of some form, was really important to Neanderthals. And there's a lot of different sort of ways that we come at that. Partly they have a bone here that's important in supporting the throat, and it's very similar to ours, suggests that they could make vowel sounds a lot like us. There's new work that's been done on the ear anatomy, which indicates that their hearing was tuned into the same kind of sound frequencies, very similar to ours. And that includes some consonant sounds like t, k, h, that kind of sound. So that broadens the range of potential vocal things. But what they actually talked about, that's the big question. And for me, I think their vocal communication must have been beyond anything we see in other animals, or at least other animals where we can understand what they are talking about to each other, because that's a whole other issue. There are animals with very complicated vocal communication. But for example, other primates, chimpanzees, you've got to think Neanderthals are going to be far more similar to us than chimpanzees, and that speech is really part of their everyday life. And presumably food, it's about survival, and as Rob says, it's also about pleasure and enjoyment. That's got to be one of the main things that people sit around and talk about, like, oh, you didn't cook it well, or that kind of thing.
And certainly in other primates, I mean, one of the things around which there's a lot of vocal communication, not language, but communication, is food. How much food? Is this food I'd like to share? Is it tasty? Food and dangerous things, like we know from other primates, those get communicated. So those seem like obvious candidates. Maybe we have a lot more questions coming in, but we should also make sure we get to the last recipe item.
Yeah, we've got about 15 minutes left, and I don't want to miss out on talking about this dessert. I see that the pears are already out. So I'm going to push Anna to solo view here, and maybe she can tell us just a bit about the recipe that she has created.
Yes, sure. So this is honey baked pears. And so for this, I'm just peeling some pears. I'm going to take out the core, but leave the stalk on. And then I'm just going to make a little mixture with some sloe gin. This is some I made myself. The sloes come from Wormwood Scrubs, which is a little green area nearby. They're very urban. But anyway, this has been brewing since September, and I've just distilled it.
That looks enviably good.
And I'm going to mix a little bit of that with some honey and a bit of water, and then pour that over the pears and just cook them for about 45 minutes, just until they're sort of tender. And then I'm going to add some blackberries. So I'll just show you. I've actually got it at that stage already. Here, so they've been cooking for a little while, and I've got the blackberries in there, and I'm going to keep basting that, and they'll turn and sort of deeper purple as they cook. So yeah, that's doing that. Hang on, I'll just take this off. It's a bit noisy.
I can only imagine what it smells like in there right now.
Yeah, it smells quite good. And then the other bit is, I made this earlier actually. This is like a sort of crumble I did without using any dairy. So it's just some oats and some hazelnuts. You could use cob nuts if you could get hold of them. A bit of honey and some oil. And I just tossed it all together, tiny pinch of salt just to take the edge off the sweetness, and roast it in the oven. And I'm going to serve the pears with that, because I think that will be quite a nice combination, a bit of crunch. And obviously for modern day taste, it'd be lovely to have this with yogurt or something like that, or cream or ice cream, but I know that obviously was not what they had in those days. So there we go, that's what we're having.
So that's wonderful. So I have a question for you, Rebecca, in this context. So we know that Neanderthals had very similar sweet taste receptors to our sweet taste receptors. We know the genes. So they would have enjoyed sweet things. What was available to them, and what could they have sought out?
Well, this one was the trickiest one to kind of do this dish, actually, because we knew we wanted a dessert, and as you say, we know that they can taste sweet things, and so it would be enjoyable. So I went for pears because we already had apples in different recipes. So There's no evidence for pears being eaten, but they are native to Eurasia, in smaller form. So they were around. And certainly blackberries, brambles, if you're living in interglacial environments, in woods, and even in slightly cooler periods, brambles are going to be around, and they're certainly going to be noticeable because they scratch you and everything. And the berries are so distinctive and seasonally available. So that makes sense that they may have been sampled and tried and enjoyed, and maybe something that children in particular were involved with. But the nuts, again, we have from a number of Neanderthal sites across their range. In the remains of hearths, you find tiny pieces of different kinds of plants, and this includes different nuts and seeds as well. So it's very likely that they were collecting the species that were around them in any site. So there's no reason why hazelnuts wouldn't have been involved in that. And we do find them in some sites. And for later hunter-gatherers in Europe during the Mesolithic, when it was warm like it is now, hazelnuts were super important, and they're a good source of protein and fats.
This is paleo Nutella.
Yeah, exactly. But the oats are in there again because we do have evidence of wild grains being used, and oats are quite a visible wild grain when they're around, so that's possible. And as I mentioned before, when I was talking about the recipe for the adhesive, where you have pine resin mixed with beeswax, the fact that they understand that you can get beeswax from bees, you can surely, if you're getting the beeswax, you found the honey as well. And if you look at hunter and gatherer populations, they will do a lot to get honey, because most of the time it's the only really sweet thing in the local environment, and it's highly sought after. So I would imagine certainly the Neanderthals in Italy who were making that glue from this site, and this is why we called it Dolce di Fossalone, it's from this site, they must have also been, sampling the honey and presumably enjoyed that. So that's kind of why we came up with the dish like this. Oh yeah, and that's what the question is up there. Yes, that is for a glue for sticking together multi-part tools. So that's where that's from.
I like the idea that there's a group of Italian honey-loving Neanderthals that they eat so much honey they have wax left over and have to invent other kinds of tools so they can use it.
Yeah, I mean, and it's so true. Neanderthals lived across a huge range. I'm in Wales, Italy, Germany, Palestine, and Siberia. There's gonna be regional cuisines and understandings of what's tasty and what's available. We see the same variety in how they make the stone tools. There's regional differences, and one of the fun sort of things that's mentioned is in my book is this tortoise tradition you get in the Mediterranean. That tortoises are native there, and they're warm and dry environments, and Neanderthals enjoyed eating tortoises, and it seems to be one of the ways that you cook them that they most often do is they flip them and just roast them in the shell and then sort of tear them apart and stuff. So I would not be surprised if there were really quite different foods being eaten and enjoyed. And if a Neanderthal from one part of their world happened to be transported to the other side, they might sort of look at what was being eaten and be like, what is that?
Can you imagine that moment when the first Neanderthal figures out you can just flip the turtle over and roast it? Like, it's like
mind blown.
A young community that knew how to do it, and then people come, that's good. We'll do that.
Yeah, and shellfish, they did eat marine food, and that's also interesting because that's quite common along the Mediterranean and the Atlantic edge of Iberia, but not further north. We don't see that in sort of the French coast, and that might be to do with the fact that many of those coastal sites are now covered by the sea. But it might also be because nobody really fancies wading around in the freezing cold Atlantic up there. Even today, it's a bit of a challenge. So, you have to also think about what was enjoyable for them to actually source and forage as well.
So, Rebecca, we know that when ancient modern humans, so our species comes west through Europe and first meets up with Neanderthals farther south, that their culinary cultures are very different. They use different tools. They eat some different things. What evidence is there for whether and how Neanderthal diets shift after that meeting?
There isn't evidence of that. I mean, basically, in terms of the interbreeding, we know that it was going on periodically over about 100,000 years, because Homo sapiens are getting into Eurasia from Africa a lot earlier than we used to think. The main period of genetic exchange that's the legacy in living people comes from about 55,000. But over that period, it's very difficult for us to work out what's going on culturally. You know, there's clearly exchange of genes, but, you know, were they exchange of technologies, knowledge about plants, things like this? It's really hard for us to tell. We can see some technological differences between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, but in fact, overall, the diets don't look that different. And that's been one of the things that's been overturned. And I talk about it a lot in the book. You know, many arguments for why did Neanderthals disappear. In the past, that's included theories about what they ate. They couldn't catch big game, they couldn't catch the mammoth. Well, we know that's not true. Or maybe they weren't broad enough and they weren't including all the small game. And now that doesn't seem to be true either. So I'm sure there were novelties within each population that each one sort of encountered. And perhaps birch tar, that's something we know Neanderthals knew how to make out of birch bark. And that's been used historically, sort of almost like a chewing gum with medicinal things. So maybe there's something, you know, going on there, that there was some exchange of Eurasian plant and animal knowledge to early Homo sapiens. So we may have benefited from that. Specifically, just as we received some genes to do with immunity and things like that.
It's fascinating. I'm going to push to Anna quick because we only have about 4 minutes left. So I want to check in and see where our dishes are on their journey to completion.
Okay. So here is a rabbit stew that I made a bit earlier, just so that it would be ready in time. Don't know if you can see that pipe. I don't want to tip it everywhere. So that's ready, and I'm just going to put a little bit of wild garlic on the top. So I've got these lovely wild garlic with lots of nice flowers here. It's quite pretty. So I might put a couple of those on the top, just to make it lovely. And I'll just get the carrots out, see where they're at as well.
I see a young forager has arrived.
Yes, sorry.
After the slow gin.
Exactly. I don't know if you can see that properly, but yeah,
that's lovely.
Lovely.
And I'll just get the carrots out. Where are my? I've lost my oven gloves somewhere. Oh, they're here. There we go. So they just need a little drizzle of honey, and then they'll be ready.
Oh, beautiful.
Nice and caramelized. Okay. And then the pears, they should be taking on a bit more colour now. There we go.
Wow.
So
those caramelized so pretty.
if I just show you where the blackberries are, they'll look more pretty. I might just put it on a plate for you so you can see what it looks like. It might be easier, but you see it's got all the blackberries in there. A nice purple juice. So it's really yummy. And then obviously we've got the crumble that I made earlier. So if I just plate up, then I can show you what it all looks like when it's all finished.
Fantastic. We'll come right back to you. Just give me the cue when you're ready to go.
There's definitely a pink thing there. We've got the pink juice on the pears and the pink nettle cordial. It's very exciting. And the pink marrow.
Yeah, I would definitely enjoy this meal. I'm disappointed that it's like an ocean away from where I am right now. But you will eat well tonight.
Rebecca, what do you think the next couple of decades look like with our changing understanding of Neanderthal foods? Are we rapidly learning new things, or what's it look like?
I think it's probably going to continue as we make it standard to apply these really whizzy 21st century archaeological science methods and techniques, and we make that standard when we excavate sites, which is, it's already standard, but we apply it to all the different sediments, and I think we will start to pull out more diversity in the plants, certainly. And as I mentioned, with the isotopic analysis, actually looking at the Neanderthal bones themselves to see what proportion of plant proteins might have been eaten. That's going to be interesting. And perhaps also, Neanderthals, they like to surprise us, and maybe there's some more sort of things waiting to be found to do with those tricky things we were talking about, like processing and storage, things like this, and like actual recipes, things that were mixed. I think it would be really fascinating to find out about those. And it would bring together some of the questions that Rob's book talks about, to do with taste and preference and fermenting things, all of those things. I think we'll continue to find out more details.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think we've got a plate plated and almost in time. We're right at the end.
We are. Let's take a quick look here. Got the beautiful carrots going on.
1 second, one more carrot.
Wow.
Okay.
So quick plating.
Gorgeous.
Oh, lovely. That's lovely.
Yeah.
Beautiful colors.
And then I need to get a pear on a plate really quick if I can. 1 second.
All right, walk us through it. Got our caramelized pears.
Yeah, so we've got these
blackberries,
honey baked pears, and then we've got this lovely crumble here with hazelnuts and oats, and then the blackberries, just to give a really nice flavour to it. Just need a spoon.
and the beautiful color that comes from them too. We were talking about how everything's just a little pink tinge today.
Yeah, too. Sorry, just pour a little bit of sauce over the top, because that's what makes it yummy. One more blackberry, and then we're ready. There we go. Oops. Can you see that?
Gorgeous.
Wow.
You guys did amazing at creating these recipes. They're beautiful to look at.
And we will all online. So if you want to do this at home, everything's there for you.
No,
Yep.
we've had it easy. Anna's had the hard job doing it all on camera today.
Right, it's a bit hot, that's all.
Well, thank you all so much for taking the time to talk with us today. I had a really wonderful kind of Neanderthal cook-along and learned a lot about the history of Neanderthals and what they ate. So thank you so much, Anna and Rebecca, for donating your time to us this morning. And Rob, as always, it's wonderful to chat with you. And thank you to everyone who took the time out of their day to check in with us and watch the show. Thanks for sampling our brains, and until next time, eat well.
I know it's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you. Makes me act the way